CGCC members and friends, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our continued CGCC 2020 Path Forward series. It is the seventh consecutive year we conduct the annual business survey on Chinese enterprises in the U.S. and present our latest research data to our members and friends. On behalf of CGCC, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all member companies for their being involved in this year's survey. We also extend our sincere appreciation to PwC. Our cooperation with PwC in developing the survey report has been very positive and constructive. As in previous years, our 2020 business survey highlights both the challenges to and the vitality of the Chinese business community in the United States. Roughly 78% of the surveyed people had said they have been negatively impacted by the ongoing U.S. China trade war, with a key challenge being supply chain management and cross-border personnel exchanges. As the administration is weighing additional aggressive economic action against China, U.S.-China relations are at historical low. The recent development of various policies, executive action, and legislation towards China has created a disturbing environment filled with uncertainty and unprecedented challenges. It is unclear what lies ahead in a post-COVID-19 and post-election world that seems to be putting our two countries on a path to the new Cold War. However, at the same time, this year's survey also shows incredible optimism and resilience on the part of Chinese companies operating in the U.S. Despite the numerous challenges and barriers to entry and operation, the U.S. market remains a top priority for CGCC member investments and expansion interest. For example, over 95% of the surveyed companies assert they will continue to operate in the U.S., while nearly 70% will stick to their prior investment plans. Furthermore, the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated Chinese companies care deeply about their local communities in the U.S. Many of our members have led donation efforts in their respective states and cities. For instance, CGCC and its members have donated more than 3.8 million pieces of PPE across the entire United States during the pandemic period. The same time of commitment by U.S. firms operating in China was recently reflected in a report published by the U.S. China Business Council. According to the USCBC 2020 member survey reports, despite the deteriorating economic environment in 2018 and 2019, 83% of their U.S. member companies regard China as the #1 priority or among their top 5 for global strategy. Among 70% of the surveyed companies also said they are optimistic about the commercial prospects of the Chinese market over the next 5 years. In 1972, the meeting between Chairman Mao and President Richard Nixon was a grand breakthrough of this significant relationship. Today, after 44 years, the Chairman Mao left us. We are standing at the crossroad, hoping for a new chapter of the great story. The past 4 decades have been the most stable period in history for U.S.-China relations. Business communities in both countries understand the mutually beneficial and dependent nature of this relationship. In a year marked by uncertainty and tumult, our surveys demonstrate how much we value our relationships with the American consumers, labor force, and the communities. Here at CGCC, we have a track record of creating opportunities among members. We focus on building deep and constructive relationships within our community across the United States. I'm confident today's event will give the public unique and accurate view into the optimism and resilience that commonly define the business cooperation between our two countries. It is our hope we can weather this storm together, seek compromise, promote mutual respect, and build a brighter future as we climb our way out of this tragic pandemic and economic collapse. I would also like to welcome and express our deepest appreciation to Ambassador Max Baucus, Professor Sachs, Mr. Bryan Lanza, and Mr. Craig Strandberg for joining our panel today. Your achievements and the dedication to your respective fields are both extraordinary and noble. Your presence today represents your ongoing commitment to sharing knowledge and building bridges. While the events are conducted virtually, we hope today's discussion can bring all of us one step closer to finding peace and opportunity for growth, stability, and sustainability between the two largest economies in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Xu, for those insightful remarks. I think there's no question that we are all seeking these days is certainly health, peace, and stability. So as Chairman Xu mentioned, the business communities in both countries understand the mutually beneficial and interdependent nature of U.S. China economic relations. In the midst of a complicated environment, the data and information presented in the report, which was launched last month, has really become more important than ever in assisting various stakeholders, government officials, business executives to really better understand the position of Chinese investments in the U.S. as really an integral part of overall the bilateral business relationship. So now, actually, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, I believe they say a video is worth at least 1 million. One could be more, but who's counting? In light of that, the CGCC has prepared a short video to summarize some of the key findings of the 2020 Annual Business Survey Report. Let us now turn on the video and watch closely.
2020 marks the 7th consecutive year that the China General Chamber of Commerce USA has conducted its annual business survey on Chinese enterprises in the United States. The survey provides a broad understanding of Chinese investments in the U.S. and the vital role they play in the overall bilateral business relationship. The survey is based on data collected from around 200 Chinese enterprises. The respondents' operations spanned a broad range of 10 sectors based on the Global Industry Classification Standard. The respondents' headquarters are located in 19 states, with subsidiary offices and facilities across the country. Chinese companies hold substantial interest towards investing in the U.S. economy, but there are disruptions as a result of the U.S. China trade conflicts and the pandemic. So for many surveyed, 2019 marked a 5-year downturn for companies' growth and profitability. 33% of the respondents claimed a decrease in revenue last year. As this graphic illustrates, Chinese companies' investments in the U.S. tumbled significantly this year. You can see the percentage drop is almost double from the previous 2 years. Companies impacted by ongoing uncertainties are delaying making new investments in the U.S. There's no question the complexity of U.S.-China relations is the top systemic challenge when it comes to conducting business in the U.S. Cultural differences between the U.S. and China also emerged as one of the top challenges this year. In the current bilateral climate, Chinese companies are actively seeking strategies to ease or mitigate cultural conflicts experienced here in the U.S. Sadly, most companies are not expecting these difficulties to fade away anytime soon. Despite these challenges, 80% of respondents report satisfaction with the overall business environment in the U.S. They appreciate the nation's innovation capacity, legal environment, and financing efficiency. Over 2/3 are optimistic about the U.S. business and investment environment throughout the next 2 years. As of March of 2020, CGCC member companies invested more than $123 billion in the U.S. economy, directly employing more than 220,000 people and indirectly supporting more than 1 million jobs in the U.S. labor market. Since its founding in 2005, the CGCC has strived to create opportunities to grow Chinese investments and to facilitate trusted Chinese brands in the U.S. amid uncertainties from ongoing disputes over trade policies, COVID-19, and the upcoming U.S. presidential cycle. CGCC stands ready to support both the business community and the governments of both countries as they embark on the next phase of their significant relationship.
So as everybody could see, as demonstrated in the video, CGCC member companies and many American companies for that matter are really at an inflection point. This dark reality of an ongoing and deepening schism between the world's two largest economy weighs quite heavily on business executives in both countries as they all consider future growth strategies. As we all know, uncertainty and instability are really not friendly factors for businesses locally or global in nature. However, this year's survey, I think, also shows incredible optimism and resilience on the part of Chinese companies operating in the U.S. And as Mr. Xu mentioned, also about U.S. companies operating in China. These companies contribute significantly to local economies in their business efforts and community outreach, and also through their various corporate social responsibility programs. From a business perspective, investigations and restrictions on Chinese companies have been undergoing a transformation in recent years as the commercial and legal environment in the U.S. has changed around the world, and it's changing at an extraordinary pace, something that really is unprecedented and we haven't seen before. Responding to various new legislative changes has taken increased urgency and importance due to the volatility of political and economic relationship between China and the United States, and this uncertainty and volatility is certainly impacting global markets. Hence, we have the Path Forward series to go through in more detail. And we today have an incredible amount of expertise with us for the panel. I'm just going to give a brief introduction of our panelists. We have Ambassador Max Baucus. He was appointed as President Obama's 11th ambassador to the People's Republic of China. As a member of the Democratic Party, he was a senator from Montana for nearly 36 years, making him the longest serving senator in Montana history. Professor Jeffrey Sachs is the author and advisor to governments around the world and the United Nations. He leads global efforts to sustainable development and climate safety. He is an expert on public health and pandemics and has advised the World Health Organization at the highest level during the past 20 years. We also have with us Bryan Lanza, as a partner in Mercury's Washington, D.C. office, specializing in public affairs and media strategy. Prior to joining Mercury, Bryan served as the communications director for President Trump's transition team. His role with the Trump administration was immediately preceded by his tenure as deputy communications director for the Trump-Pence presidential campaign. And I have no doubt that many on this attending today's panel and on the panel itself would love to get a better understanding of the president's strategy pre and post-election 2016 and 2020, of course. And finally, we have with us Craig Stromberg, is on the PwC intelligence team, providing macroeconomic and geopolitical analysis to the firm leadership, enabling decision confidence about how global events may impact the firm and its clients. I'm going to go through one last housekeeping rule that while today's comments are on the record and will be published, the opinions expressed, including those of the moderator, yours truly, do not represent the institutions we all work for. That being said, let us begin our panel discussion and lead off with Ambassador Baucus. Good afternoon, gentlemen. As of March 2020, CGCC members have invested over $120 billion in the US economy. Ambassador, from a macroeconomic standpoint, we should recognize that such long-term foreign direct investment in our economy is good for us. It's good for resiliency, it's good for diversity, and it's really great for opportunity. Not to mention, it also brings in enormous revenue and support to our local service industries, law firms, consultants, accounting firms, and so forth, really in the tone of billions of dollars every year. Given that backdrop, Ambassador, what are some of the key words that describe the current trends in U.S.-China relations, and how should Chinese businesses operating in the U.S. perceive or interpret these trends after they've invested so much?
Well, thank you, Peter. And first, I want to thank Chairman Xu for leading CGCC. Those were very prescient, realistic, but optimistic remarks. And Mr. Chairman, I thank you very much for those, because I think obviously all of us, this panel, bottom line, are optimists. That is, we're trying to figure out ways to solve problems to make things work better. So thank you again for those remarks. Frankly, I think the current description that is most apt is the relationship's in a free fall. It's stunning, the degree to which we don't trust each other as much as we may have years ago. Obviously, a lot of this tension is natural. Rising power, established power, two largest economies in the world. Culture is totally different. One democracy, other is authoritarian. It's natural for there to be tension between our two countries. And it's also, I think, important to take our hat off to the degree to which China has grown so much in the last 40 years and brought with that growth a lot of if you will, Western practices like more rule of law, entering the WTO, more IP protection, lots of ways which have helped China commercially become very successful in conjunction with other companies around the world. China's come a long, long way, and to be credited for that. I think of late, though, when I say of late, I'm thinking the last 5 or 6 years. When President Xi came to power, it became clear that the economic openness of China was starting to be questioned by President Xi, and he began to tighten up a little bit. It's his style. He may be the next, maybe re-elected president, but there's more repression today within China. I don't want to overstate the point, but slowly that's begun to happen in the last several years under President Xi. Now, the tension between our countries earlier at root was economic. And a lot of American companies having a hard time doing business in China, whether it's IP, whether it's indigenous innovation, technology transfer questions, subsidies, et cetera, caused a little problem for American companies trying to do business in China. Although, obviously, as the largest market in the world, American companies very much want to stay in China and conduct as much business as possible. But nevertheless, China began to tighten up a little bit, and it was a bit difficult for American companies. The real change here has been national security. Both countries have weaponized national security. I noticed it when I was in China. The Chinese government passed national security legislation used to rationalize many ways which they could crack down on U.S. companies doing business in China, especially tech companies, under the guise of national security. Part of it was legitimate. China wanted to protect its national security, but part of it also was a front to protect Chinese companies at the expense of American companies. We Americans too have weaponized national security. I mean, if most of the adverse actions that we've taken, the Trump administration has taken against China, are in the rubric of national security, protect ourselves with backdoor, spying, or whatnot. And too much, in my judgment, on both sides has been under the label of national security. That causes increased nationalism in both countries. It causes public opinion in both countries to be more opposed to the other country. It has to be addressed. I think this period is not going to last terribly long, but it cannot last more than a year or two longer. Why? Because we need each other. We need each other. And China's not going to go away as a country. China's going to have an economy larger than the U.S. in not too many years from now. We have to recognize that as Americans and begin to work with China, not try to scare China off. I know we're time constrained here, but I'll make one couple of points here. The problem here is, in many respects, there are too many today who want to prevent China's rise. Too many Americans want to stop China's rise. It ain't going to happen. China cannot be prevented from rising. And once we get over that in America, that's going to help the relationship. And the same thing, because I find, frankly, that the Chinese are quite restrained compared with all the rhetoric that's occurring in the U.S. My final point is this. A lot of people ask, what's going to happen? And I got thoughts on that. But the real question is, what do we want to happen? We as participants should help figure out ways for our two countries to work better together, to respect each other, and not just criticize each other or be armchair observers trying to describe what's going to happen, but participate and make this.
I think that's a good segue, actually. I'd like to turn right actually at that point to Professor Sachs. Professor Sachs, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
You've published an enormous amount actually on this topic, which I've actually caught up on my reading recently, and globalization and sustainability. What are your views on this trend, and actually directly pointed to what the ambassador just stated?
Well, I think what Ambassador Baucus said is exactly right, that we ought to be cooperating with each other. I hope that this will go away. I'm not sure that it will. It's mainly driven by America and American anxieties and an American playbook, which is a Cold War mentality, which says there's only one country that can be at the top, and that's America. We're supposed to have primacy according to our foreign policy doctrine. We're supposed to have military primacy in every major region of the world. And here comes China with a lot of nerve, being so capable. And that's really the U.S. mindset of these nationalists that are in power. We've seen this before. We go through these kinds of phases in American politics, a kind of zealousness and extremism. The Trump administration is truly an extremist administration. I don't think America should be afraid of China, but they're afraid of China in the White House, that's for sure. I'm not afraid of China and believe that China's success is a global success, a great civilization that has escaped from poverty, developed advanced technologies, is a great benefit for the world, not a curse for the world. A lot will depend on this election in November. Even well, if Trump wins, I think the world will be profoundly dangerous and unstable, like he is himself. But if Biden wins, we're going to have a period of more protectionism in the United States, that's for sure. But I think we'll also have a return to rational ideas and not this kind of quite flagrant and obnoxious and provocative attack and name calling, which is not just words, but quite dangerous, actually, when we're talking about leaders of the United States using the kind of language that they do, because it riles up extremism on the other side too. So I'm extremely worried about this. I think my advice to China is basically you can't solve this problem on China's side. This is an American problem, not a China problem.
But Professor, let me
sure.
I don't want to call push back, or let me just maybe just question one of your statements.
Yeah.
gravity seems to be, or the laws of physics when it comes to China in the halls of Congress seem to be being defied right now, where you're seeing that on a more of a bipartisan level of both this level of extremism and legislation towards China or Chinese companies. Are you concerned about that trend and that direction, that it's now become more of a bipartisan issue?
Of course, I'm concerned. You know, this is typical Americana. First, we had this with the Soviet Union, where things were taken to such extremes, even after Stalin's death, that we engaged in an absolutely reckless nuclear arms race that almost ended the world. Then we had terror that Japan was going to take over. In the 1980s, that's when I came into economics, and Japan as #1 was everything. And you projected they were going to own everything. They're going to own the whole U.S. economy. And of course, the U.S. went to work to try to bash the Japanese economy, which it did, just to tell them, hey, look, you stay in your place. And the American attitude is to China, look, in an American-led world, you can do fine, but this is an American-led world. Don't forget that. And we will stop semiconductors flowing, we'll stop technology, we'll cut you out. I think it's extraordinarily dangerous and misguided and naive, especially naive. And I hope it goes away with Trump, because this is the most naive government I have seen in my lifetime. And it's absolutely flagrant and irresponsible. But what I was saying was, I think China's best response, frankly, is to be nice to other countries. Don't respond to American provocations other than being open and cooperative with the neighborhood in China, with RCEP, with the European Union, because the rest of the world is ready to deal with China, except if China looks so aggressive that everybody falls instinctively under the U.S. military umbrella, which would be a disaster and very sad and extremely dangerous. And
so it sounds like your advice would be similar to Chinese companies as well operating in the U.S.
Well, you know, Chinese companies cannot fix this right now, by the way, because when you have the president on the podium, you know, Trump sucks out all the air of everything in our country. So all we do is Trump morning till night. And you can't battle that in public relations, being nice, anything. You just keep your head down, do your work as best you can. But I think what's really important is normal relations of China with the rest. If instead China says, look, you know, this is a hostile world, we've got to get tough, that's going to be quite bad, actually. And that is an instinct also. That's a dangerous instinct. Okay, if they're putting their allies together, we're going on the other side. That would be to the U.S. benefit, and to, in the short run, there's no benefit in this at all over the long term for anybody. But the best thing for China to do is to say, look, we're multilateral, we're open. We want to clean up our economy, by the way, from pollution. We want to move to a green economy. We want to help lead on climate change and so on. The thing that really triggered this, by the way, was Made in China 2025, because suddenly American strategists woke up to the fact that, oh my God, China's going to be on the cutting edge of military technologies, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and that's what triggered this. Because in the U.S. mentality, there's only one country on the top, and that's the U.S.
That I understand. And let me, before we get to that topic, actually, I want to turn to Bryan, because I know Bryan's on the opposite spectrum, if you will, the political aisle here. Bryan, what
how could it be?
Bryan, I'm glad we're virtual right now.
Why is that?
It makes it a little easier right now to have this conversation over the internet than in person.
I'm just glad we're having the conversation.
That's right. Bryan, give us your view. Clearly an opposite one, but your insight into these trends and the president.
Listen, I would say the way the president, sees China, at least during the campaign and where it's ultimately evolved to where we are today, his economic positions towards China were very much the Democratic Party positions. He was a Democrat most of his life, and he developed his anti-China policies, from a pro-labor, pro-democratic filter. And so you had that come into the Republican Party for the first time. It used to be sort of the party of Wall Street. We now became, with Trump, the party of the American worker. And Trump had what he had was that mandate to address it, because he talked so much about it during the campaign. And when he came into Washington and he started hiring, some of the more institutional Washington people, that policy, of manufacturing, of jobs, blended in with the national security crowd, the Rubios, the Cottons, who saw China as a threat, who see China in the, and I'm not going to speak for them, but in sort of our interpretation, they see China, similar to that of the Soviet Union. As the professor said, seeking, China's now become more nationalistic. They've become more, at least the administration, some of the Republicans view, they become more authoritarian. And so when you couple the economic manufacturing threat that clearly took place in Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and those communities being gutted by the loss of manufacturing jobs, and you sort of supercharge it with the national security crowd, you've now had Trump's policy on China evolved and actually become more restrictive as he looks at the chessboard. This administration very much sees Chinese tech as a national security issue. And it's an important discussion to have. And I think the policymakers are going to have this discussion. Some would say before Trump, the American policymakers had their head in the sands with respect to China policy. The Bush administration was solely focused on, how much economic commerce can we create through this? The Obama administration became obsessed with, we can't criticize China, they can control so much of our debt. And I think we're now to the point where, the president and his crew see it as like, they've grown so much and they've become this manufacturing super base, but now they're blending into tech, and that becomes a problem for them. And they see it as a real national security threat.
Sorry to interrupt, but it does defy a little bit of reality here that the relationship has been bilateral, has been mutually beneficial. A lot of manufacturing went to automation, certainly a great deal went to China, but the U.S. economy as a whole, businesses and consumers still benefited enormously from that.
Yeah, sure. But, let's be clear. President Trump is in office primarily because of the China policy of the Bush and Obama presidency. It's because they gutted communities, and Clinton. Let's add Clinton to this. I'm not throwing everybody in there. It's all U.S. presidents who've been dealing with China sort of had a poor approach in the last 24 years. And so, when you had these trade agreements and you had NAFTA, you had these commitments that you retrain all these workers to give the new economic opportunities, and those commitments never took place. So whereas the consumer, ended up paying less for the cars, ended up paying less for manufacturing goods, the jobs, the working class people in Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, they lost their jobs without any of the retraining. And that's who President Trump spoke to when he was running for president. It was different. There was a different Republican who was running and targeting a different audience for the presidency. Normally, these aren't our audiences. Normally, we have the Republican, fair trade, not reciprocal trade, or free trade, not fair trade conversation. I think President Trump changed that orthodoxy for Republicans. And I go back to, when he came to Washington, D.C., already suspicious of China with respect to the manufacturing and how it's gutted a lot of these neighborhoods. And he married that with, conservative GOP neocon, us against them, China, technology threat. You've become, in this environment of this supercharge where everything becomes suspicious about China. I'm not scared of China. I want to compete against China. I think the president wants to compete, but I think he just wants a level playing field to compete. And he's always said it. He's told President Xi, in China, he looks forward to competing. But he, in his view, when you look at what happened to these communities in Ohio, Pennsylvania, he didn't view that as fair.
Brian, let me interrupt you for a moment. I know Professor Sachs certainly wants to give a lecture right now on globalization and the benefits of that, but I gotta move first to Craig.
And thank him for my cheap car.
But I also want to say that I agree with a lot of what Bryan said as a description of this process. I think he really gets it right. But when he says that we view Chinese technology from a national security base, it basically is this paradox that says, well, China cannot have the same technology we have. And that is doomed to make conflict if you have a world in which one country says, we can have it, but no one else can have it. That is exactly the Cold War mentality that nearly got us all blown up the first time around, and they want to do it again. The other point I would add very quickly, but I thought the description's fine, I mean, I agree with it, is we shouldn't really exaggerate or take as given that this was China that gutted all of these communities. All of the evidence shows that most of this was actually automation, as well as NAFTA and other globalization trends. China's not the decisive factor in the loss of Midwest jobs, but it's very effective politically. I couldn't agree more on that point. It was a master stroke of a political campaign to make the union working class the Trump vote, and it got him the presidency. So I agree with that. I think it was exactly right. But to make a Cold War and to risk blowing up the world over this kind of thing, it's a kind of madness, actually. But we're capable of it.
Craig, let me turn to you real fast in brief. I want to turn it back to Chinese businesses and they're operating in the U.S. here. I mean, looking again at these trends that the professor and Bryan have described and the ambassador, how do you advise, or how are you seeing these trends and advising your clients?
So thank you, Peter, and thanks to the CGCC for having the panel so we can talk about this. I think there are, in the broadest sense, three things that are sort of converging upon us at the moment. So first, if you look in between the lines of everything we've talked about so far, at least in my lifetime and experience, macroeconomics, trade, and geopolitics have never been more intertwined than they are now. You can no longer separate those things. Second, U.S. protectionism has been on the rise in recent years, not just in the current administration, but in recent years. That affects all of the members of the CGCC and other foreign companies. But the other trend that's going on that we're watching is something that you alluded to, Peter, which is that there is a not just cross-aisle consensus in Washington that is developing about China, but there is a feeling about China and its objectives, false or positive, that is seeping into what we are reading in the media. It's seeping into some of what we're reading into from think tanks. And so if you are a business, it's somewhat hard to figure out where are some of the answers to your questions. I think the absolutes that we're dealing with are these, which is that if you look at the CGCC survey and you listen to Chinese companies in the United States, they want to be here. And if you look at what American and European companies are saying about being in China, and the best way to do that is through CGCC's counterparts, right? Through the American Chamber of Commerce in China and the European Chamber of Commerce in China. In the latest survey in May, so just a few months ago, 83% of US companies in China are under no consideration whatsoever of leaving. They're not even considering the possibility of shifting supply chain. They want to be in China, and many of them want to be in China for China, to produce Chinese goods for the Chinese marketplace. For European companies, it was even higher. It was 89% are not thinking of leaving. So regardless of what's happening at the policy level, the fact is that at the very least, when it comes to the business communities from these economies, they do want to be in one another's marketplaces, and they do have a voice. So I think that's something we ought to think about as we go forward for the rest of the conversation.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. Bryan, I'm going to turn to you to start off with the next question or topic, a little more sort of Washington focused, if you will. The landscape, as we talked about, really has changed drastically in a very short period of time. You were intimately involved in the 2016 transition. Once elected, how do you see a transition process playing out, whether it's a Biden first term or potentially I know Professor Sachs doesn't want to see a Trump second term. How is that transition even happening right now, or will that play out? How long will it last? How long will it take companies to get an understanding of sort of, what type of political mind shift might happen, regardless of which candidate gets into office?
Well, I think, when President Trump wins in November, I'll send the professor a MAGA hat for his collector's editions there. But
right. We got to be cordial.
It's a historical item.
I got to keep my job.
No, I would say this. It's right now the transition. It's in September. They're having discussions, at least on the Biden side. The re-elect is a different perspective, but on the Biden side, their transitions having discussions about what the China policy is going to look like. They're having principals sort of sit down and lay out what they see as President Biden's visions on some of the statements he made, some of the commitments he made, and how to merge them into policy through the National Security Council, the State Department, and the Department of Commerce. And I think right now, at least from the Trump experience in 2016, it was a robust conversation. And you're looking at staff. Staff very much is policy. So I think, when you look at some of these hires that come out, if Biden were to win, you see these staff hires, that's pretty much going to tell you the type of policy that a President Biden and what angle he's going to, and what view he wants to see the Chinese filter. As for the Trump, I got to tell you, I think it's, for me, how I look at it, I think it's very TBD in the second term. I think for the first time, you've seen a very aggressive Secretary of State in Pompeo, sort of playing the more policeman role, whereas in the past, the Secretary of State played the more negotiator role in international policy. So I think a second term, if Pompeo stays significantly longer, I think you're going to see a more aggressive posture from this administration, and you're going to see that in a lot of hirings, through the short-term transition. But I think the secretary will have, along with O'Brien, will have a very strong thumbprint on how they want the next 4 years to be viewed as through a Trump presidency. And it's those discussions, probably happening now, probably already happened. I know the White House's PPO, they're going through the interview process of interviewing new people already of who want to come into the administration. Some have been happening at the request of, I suspect, Secretary Pompeo. But, I would say if you're navigating Washington, D.C., the Biden approach is going to be wait and see, because the environment is so anti-China in Washington, D.C. It's bipartisan. He's not going to have the same runway that he would have had during Obama administration, where there was a lot of latitude. I think this Congress has gotten more aggressive in pushing back against the executive, regardless of previous executives. And I think Trump, he wants reciprocal trade with China, but I think he's to the standpoint where he wanted to follow the Reagan model, trust and verify, but the verification isn't there yet that China wants reciprocal trade with the U.S. That's how they are sort of looking at the next 30, 60 to 90 days.
That's very helpful, Professor Sachs, because you advise governments, the United Nations, global leaders, I'm sure, and previous administrations as well. How do you see the transition either to a second Trump term or a Biden first term playing out?
Well, as I've said, and in all seriousness, I see the current path as being very dangerous because geopolitics is not a game, and it's not this kind of flamboyant approach if one is serious in preserving peace. And I think that the current approach indeed would probably intensify after Trump reelection. And I know enough of history to say that it worries me profoundly. And while the Cold War somehow seems like a rather compact and contained and rather clever policy of the United States, we nearly blew up the world on several occasions, very, very close, once by a vote of 2-1 in a Soviet submarine offshore of Cuba. And I don't want that for my children and grandchildren again, but that's the direction literally we're heading. With Biden, we're definitely heading towards more protection and so on. And I think for the political reasons that Peter explained, Bryan explained. But what I do think is really important, and what I would recommend, not that anyone's listening, is to try to stabilize the relations of two giants through serious, ongoing, bureaucratic, long-term processes. In other words, China-U.S. relations should not be around meetings of two presidents. It shouldn't be, to an even much greater extent, anything like Pompeo giving these really absurd speeches that he's been giving, or acting in this evangelical way. Maybe he really does believe the world's about to come to an end. I've heard that he does. Well, he's doing his best to bring it closer in the way that he's speaking. This is absolutely not how two superpowers should be responding right now. We should have committees that work round the year to understand each other. By the way, not only on military, technology, trade, finance, monetary, climate, but also on culture and history and other areas as well. This is an extraordinarily important relationship. And it's extraordinarily important for the world to take seriously. I don't think that Trump behaves this way at all. And again, I'm not even speaking partisan. I'm just speaking as an observer of, it's not because I am partisan or not on this, by the way. I've seen excellent foreign policy on Republican presidents, and I've seen awful foreign policy of Democratic presidents. And this is dangerous, what we're in right now. So I would urge Biden, if he's elected, to try to stabilize this relationship, not to agree on everything, but to agree that everything should be calm, cautious, long-term, bureaucratic, and with respect to a civilization that is 2,200 years old. China's been around the block a few times, and it should not be treated in this disgraceful way that we are rhetorically treating China now. They didn't steal everything. They didn't cheat on everything. They didn't create all these conflicts. This is just our social media, Trump world craziness. It works.
A new reality that we're living in.
It works, but it works to blow us up. It doesn't work to understand anything. And we have to be more grown up about how we live in this world. And we're not very grown up right now because none of us understands how ideas are formed anymore. But
let me interrupt that for a moment, if you will. Ambassador Baucus, profound remarks by Professor Sachs. You're probably the closest that has worked, because you worked under an Obama-Biden administration advising the government on China, U.S. China relations. How do you see this transition playing out? Let's just talk in terms of potential Biden election win.
Well, it's kind of interesting. I advised both Trump when he got elected, his transition, and I'm now also advising Biden's transition team. I might say that I think your earlier question about transition is a bit misplaced. That is, what's the transition procedure, et cetera. Much of this begins at the top. It begins with who's president. because that sets the tone. President Trump names his people, the State Department, to Justice, to Trade Representative, and Biden will do the same thing. It really comes down to the tone at the top that determines, I think, that the people, the lower levels, the bureaucracy in implementing policy. So it really comes down to who's at the top. I think there's a profound difference between the two. I think Professor Sachs has it about right. We have one president, Trump, who governs with his Twitter account and is very public. And you're going to see a Biden president, if he's president, who's not going to be governing with his Twitter account, is going to be much more quiet and engage in more quiet diplomacy. But as has been suggested here, it's going to be firm. He's not going to be some wallflower who's going to walk away and cave to China. He's going to be very firm, A, because that's his view, and second, because domestic politics are going to push him in that direction. He's going to he'll work more with our allies. He'll work more in the foreign policy establishment. Now that's not to be a bad word, establishment, but it creates some predictability. It creates some trust worldwide. U.S. Position today, among other countries, is in the toilet. Other peoples, other countries, leaders in other countries are asking themselves, what's happened to the United States? Why is the United States declining? They want the United States to lead, because the United States has, as Professor Sachs said, engaged in this view that, well, we lead the world. Now, the world is changing, but other countries, Western countries, still want the U.S. to lead. I think a key point here is that under Biden, you'll see more stabilization. You'll see more efforts to get engaged in a longer-term relationship with China, because we have to. China's not going anywhere. For the sake of our kids and our grandkids, we got to figure out a way to deal with China. And the stronger we are internally, economically, with infrastructure and education and so forth, that's going to have a huge, profound effect on influencing China. If China sees us as strong, China will be like, oh gosh, the United States is a strong country. We can't push too hard here, or if we do, there are going to be consequences. The United States also should develop a longer-term strategic plan with respect to China. We haven't had one under any president. When I was serving over there, I was stunned at how ad hoc we were, the United States was, how reactionary we were to various Chinese events. We didn't have a long-term strategic plan. I know it's hard. It's very hard to put one together, especially in a representative democracy. With congressional elections every 2 years, politics sometimes gets in the way. Presidential elections every 4 years, but we have to try. We have to do our very best to develop a longer term, settle down, don't get too hysterical, longer term strategic plan as we work with China. China wants that. China wants a stable relationship with the United States because we're joined economically at the hip. We depend upon each other.
I agree with that.
And American and Chinese companies want to be in the U.S. market. So let's just, play on our strengths, the desire of businessmen to want to do business in each other's country, and let's build on a relationship from there. And also, I might say, Fisher, there are already today there are a good number of working groups working on cybersecurity, on the national security problem. Is how you differentiate, how you build guardrails, how you manage risk with security issues in the United States and China. We have to help those efforts, because that's going to also help the relationship.
Thank you, Ambassador. Actually, that's a very good segue. Craig, I'm going to turn to you actually for the next topic, which I know pretty much everybody in this group, and even the last group that I moderated, is interested in hearing about, which is, of course, the discussion, debates, now lawsuits over WeChat and TikTok. The U.S. has, recently announced these unexpected moves to regulate or eliminate the presence of Chinese social media platforms. How will these developments affect the domestic flow of information in both countries, in our cross-border exchanges? And how do you think these changes in perceptions will affect Chinese businesses operating in the U.S. and U.S. businesses operating in China? It's a pretty loaded debate right now, or explosive debate, and there seems to be a time clock that's ticking. What could you tell us about that?
Yeah, there seems to be some sort of fuse that has been lit. I think how long the fuse is may be up for question. But look, if you read the CGCC survey, you're going to see echoed exactly the same thing that you're going to see in Chamber of Commerce surveys from around the world. When you look at what's being said in the World Economic Forum, what's been said in recent years in the PwC CEO survey, which is that geopolitical and regulatory uncertainty is the top concern of businesses. Because what we've seen in recent years has been a particularly uncertain connection and stability when it comes to regulation and trade. And where increasingly that is evolving as a center of gravity is about data. And so if I am a member of the CGCC, part of what I want to look at is what has been said about this in law that has been created through legislation and law that has been created through executive order. If it's the former, if you are looking at protectionist measures that have been created or strengthened by legislation, and a good example of this is CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US, that is something that's going to be in place, and those regulators are going to act no matter who's in charge in Washington and no matter who's in the White House. Executive orders have the force of law, but they can be altered at any time either by the president that issued them or by a different president. And so it's not that they should be ignored, but you really, I think, have to worry about those things most that are going to be there for the longest period of time. And part of the issue for particularly Chinese companies in the US is that they have had to deal with a strengthened CFIUS that is really there to look at three things. It is there to look at data. It is there to look at critical technologies, which is not always easy for Chinese companies to define. I mean, when it comes down to it, it's pretty much all the technologies that will underwrite the fourth industrial revolution. And it's there to protect critical infrastructure. And I think it is important here to say that I think when you are a Chinese or a foreign company, it can be difficult to understand the role of a regulator like CFIUS. And I think there is a perception that somewhere in the back room they're twirling their mustaches, plotting evil things against foreign companies. And I don't think that's true. Regulators follow the rules or they can't be regulators anymore. And CFIUS has a process that is pretty clear, but they've been ordered by legislation to pay far more attention when the data of American consumers is up for question. And increasingly, part of what Chinese companies are going to have to be thinking about as they invest in the US is not just asking all the old questions about what is the value of this potential partnership or investment. What is the data that I am going to be potentially acquiring in this deal, and how is a regulator going to look at it? Because that is something that, even if you go back 4 or 5 years ago, that might not have been the case. And so the data world we are in is going to drive the way that regulators are going to look at Chinese and other foreign investment. But this is going to be a global problem, because all companies, whether they're Chinese or Brazilian or American or British, are now on the cusp of a world in which the EU has its own set of privacy and data laws. The Chinese have a pretty robust set of laws between the cybersecurity law and the draft data law that they just announced this week, which isn't finalized, but it's getting there. And the US, which is, if you listen to my fellow panelists, undergoing a serious debate politically about what data means. especially what data means when China is involved.
That's,
So data is what's going to matter here going forward to companies.
that's a good point for Bryan right now, I guess. Bryan, do you think, are we at the beginning, the middle, the end? Is there something that Chinese companies, what else do Chinese companies need to do to prepare in terms of other technologies or other sectors and this form of sort of protectionist policies in line with national security interests?
Listen, I would say we're at the beginning. I think if you look at the tea leaves in Congress, it's bipartisan that seem to have the issue of Chinese technology. It's Republicans, of course, the Rubios, the Cottons, but you also have a significant number of Democrats that are leaning in. And I think when you have those situations, when you have members of Congress and the House and Senate leaning in, and you have the administration leaning in, it's almost incumbent upon the company to lean in and figure out how to navigate Washington. And I think that becomes a challenge with some Chinese companies. Mercury, we represent some, but there is a certain amount of education and awareness that comes with bringing in clients to navigate Washington, D.C., and it can get tricky. But, I think that, we're at the beginning. You're going to see more and more, regardless if, obviously if President Trump gets reelected, you're going to see the pace increase. But I do think if Biden gets elected as well, the pace is going to increase probably at a much slower pace, but there's no ignoring, what Craig said, what we've all said, that data is an inflection point here between the two governments. And we have to have the public policy discussion of what are we going to do? Who do we trust? And do we ultimately trust China with that data? That conversation is years away. And so, if you're a Chinese tech company looking to enter the U.S. market, you got to figure out how to navigate the regulators. You got to proceed with caution. There's got to be a public affairs campaign. There's got to be a PR campaign. There's got to be a lot of things that line up properly for you to enter it properly here in the U.S. But leaning in is probably the only way now to navigate this Washington. Like I said, it used to be. The criticism used to be, fair trade. Are we getting fair trade? Are we getting fair trade? We've now melded the issues to fair trade and national security, and that's not going away anytime soon because national security is so broad, and it's so trust us. We know what national security is, more so than you. You really can't put a hard target on it, and it's on purpose. It's, they don't want a hard target, from the national security. They want to be as broad as possible, and rather than give a very specific, square of what you can, work within, so they can ultimately do drawbacks. But, I think any company, you've got to engage the regulators in D.C. You've got to engage Congress because it's bipartisan heat that's coming towards Chinese businesses here in the U.S. right now.
But Professor Sachs, how then does that reconcile itself with, the parameters of foundations of globalization? We're not talking about technologies of the United States in a small country with, tens of thousands of people in it. We're talking about the two largest economies in the world. How do you reconcile that then when it comes to the WeChats, which is the main communication between the Chinese and the West right now, and TikTok, which is a platform that's primarily used by teenagers, I would argue, at least from what I've seen, certainly my daughter. But how do you reconcile that in terms of globalization?
Look, digital technologies are the drivers of world change for this century, at least for the coming decades. And what Ambassador Baucus said, and I think we all agree, we need guardrails. This is absolutely clear, and there are guardrails on technologies that are new and still evolving at a unprecedented speed. But let's remember that which companies have more data on citizens of other countries than any other companies in the world. It's of course U.S. companies. It's Facebook, it's Google, it's Amazon, it's Microsoft, it's our companies. Completely without regulation on the U.S. side, completely without transparency of what those companies do. None of us on this panel knows what those companies do with our data, what they collect, how they share them, what they share with the NSA, what they share with their clients. And this is a very serious issue. It's not just about China. It is a general issue, and we should take it seriously. So far, we've not taken it seriously within our own country on privacy, security, surveillance. We hush it all up immediately. Snowden's in exile. We don't have to think about anything he told us, and so on. So I think that this is really true, what we're saying. But I want to point out that the idea, therefore, that all critical technologies are military technologies is a terrifying approach. And that is literally the approach now, which is that anything about AI, about advanced semiconductors, about 5G, it's all military now. And our companies don't do us any favors, and our government doesn't do us any favors because we're militarizing all of our big companies. So Amazon can't wait to get Pentagon contracts. Microsoft can't wait to get Pentagon contracts. I just want to say, we will absolutely wreck our own democracy in the process. Maybe we have irrevocably, but these are very real issues. I don't want to simplify them, but they're not one-sided issues that how dare China do X. And if we persist in the meantime of closing up our national economy or trying to close up China's economy, that is the paranoid streak of American politics. And we're in it right now, and we've seen it before, and God help us. And Bryan, we'll talk after November. Anyway, I'm sure we'll be great friends. We seem to agree on almost everything, except the consequences, maybe. But in any event, I have enjoyed speaking with you. Peter, I have to run. I apologize to everybody. I have another Zoom that I have to jump to.
So you had a 3 o'clock stop.
Yeah. So let me thank all of you for a great conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. Ambassador, I'd like you to just continue this just briefly. I'm sure you have your WeChat account. American businesses use WeChat profusely, profoundly in China, and Chinese companies in the U.S. use it also as a form of communication. What is your view on how and what companies should be doing? Ambassador? And we lose the ambassador?
He's connecting.
He's connecting, or he's on mute?
I'm connecting. My computer died. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Ambassador, if you didn't hear me, I turned the WeChat conversation over to you in terms of American companies and more Chinese companies operating in the U.S. and what does this mean for them?
Yeah, I think we're at a very obviously difficult time because so much, as has been stated, revolves around data. And because we're connected to the internet, almost any company has data. And the question is, how is that utilized? It's really tough. Several points here. I think that we should try to find ways to work together, U.S. China, on standardizing various data efforts. One is 5G. We're moving with U.S. and China different directions on 5G. And there is, I don't know the name, an international standards group, but we should at least try, U.S. and China, to see if we can reach some accommodation, some agreement on standards. And there are lots of other areas where we should work on standards as well. At least that's a positive effort that we can undertake rather than just being critical of each other. I also have another observation here, and that is that we've almost come full circle. In China, many American companies trying to do business in China were forced to set up a joint venture to do business. And now that's changing. In China today, China is saying it's not as necessary to have a JV. They're letting more American companies do business in China without a joint venture. When I say turn around, this is what I mean. I'm just wondering, it came to my head about a day ago. You know, American companies want to do business in China. That's clear. GM sells more cars in China than it does in the US. Daimler-Benz sells more Mercedes in China than it does in the US. Companies want to be in China. Well, why doesn't a Chinese company call up an American company doing business in China and say, hey, let's do a JV? We, the Chinese company, in order for us to do more business in America, maybe we should joint venture with you, the American company doing business in China. And I would suspect that there's a real opportunity there for Chinese companies to talk to various American companies, try to set up some kind of a JV. So that would legitimize the Chinese company doing business in the United States. More than would be the case that if a Chinese company were trying to come straight to the US only as a Chinese company, because the atmosphere in DC against China today is just so toxic.
So Chinese companies should seek out more JVs and cooperation projects with American companies. It would be your approach, is what you're saying.
Exactly, right.
And well, that leads me into really the next point. And before we get to the Q&A, you want to talk about the phase 1 and maybe a potential phase 2 deal. So maybe if you could just continue along that thought process. You're hearing the administration talking about a total decoupling, and yet there's still a phase 1 deal in place, and discussions maybe around the phase 2, which probably won't happen until after the election. Where are we in the phase 1, phase 2 process, and how do you see that playing out?
I think phase 1 is about the only lifeline between the two countries right now. And I think, therefore, both countries are trying to keep it alive. Obviously, with COVID in China, it's difficult for Chinese to live up to its commitment to make all these purchases because the economy's down. They're trying. They're doing a pretty good job, frankly. But both countries, I think, want to maintain it. Then we can go to phase 2. And for me, phase 2 is addressing more of the structural problems that we Americans have with China. Phase 1 didn't really deal with many of the structural problems, but phase 2 would. And I think there's a lot that we as Americans should pursue that. But you can't get something for nothing. And most agreements are that, agreements. So when we're pursuing phase 2, we want something from China. We have to also have in mind what we could give China in return. That's the foundation of most agreements. I don't know what that is, but we should keep in mind some accommodation instead of just criticizing China for insufficient attention to some of the structural problems that we have with the Chinese. I think that the tariffs we've posed against the Chinese have basically backfired. They've not worked. They've hurt American consumers. We pay them, $30-some billion to American farmers to offset the trade benefits that soybean farmers have lost. It's not worked. And but what does work, that's really the question. And what does work is in my view, is some kind of strategic plan with respect to China, where we respect each other, but we got to be firm and fair with each other, and in developing that plan, we got to tell the Chinese where we can privately, where they can go and where they can't go, and where the red lines are. And once we tell them where the red lines are, we got to make sure that they understand we'll back them up, and we'll back up our red lines, and not let China cross that red line. But it's got to be quiet, it's got to be firm, it's deal with respect, and I think that's going to make a big difference, not only on trade, but also in all the other issues we've been discussing.
Bryan, do you think the president, is there a move at some point? Have you heard anything towards the phase 2? And I know you've talked about, already where Trump may lead in a second administration. isn't trade still the ballast of our relationship, if you will?
Of course, of course. You know, and I think the president is still seeking reciprocal trade with China. I know it's a phrase that's uncommon for the Republican tongue, fair trade. We usually talk more about free trade, but that's where the policy is of this president. So I think anytime, you know, whether it's China, whether it's Latin America, anytime you're looking, you know, for a reciprocal, you know, fair trade agreement between two countries, you're going to have a receptive audience with Trump. At least with President Trump and his administration. I think anything short of that, you know, continues to exasperate the issues. I told Chinese clients the first year that President Trump was in office, you know, let's resolve this as quickly as possible, just because of his disruptive nature. You know, right now he has an issue with manufacturing and purchase of goods. Like, let's resolve that as quickly as possible, because he's the type of guy, as he's negotiating and he's not getting success, he's going to start throwing more issues into the pot, making it more and more difficult to find solutions. We're now 3.5 years into this, you know, with, you know, the hopes of, you know, the phase one not being dead and leading on to a phase two, but there are more issues on the table that are becoming more and more complex. So a lot of these things, you know, as the senator says, you know, can get resolved. There's cultural things, differences that need to be, you know, the gap needs to be filled. But I think, you know, it's probably, you know, the first time a country, you know, China's dealing with this type of president that pushes back. And I think they're still analyzing, you know, what that means to them. But I do think, you know, Trump, he wants trade agreements. He wants economic prosperity, you know, for China and for the U.S., but he just wants it to be in a fair reciprocal trading pattern. And I think that's why, you know, he connects, you know, with those voters in, you know, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, because he's the first one in a long time at the presidential level, not necessarily at the congressional level, that's talking about reciprocal trade, whereas everybody for the last 24 years or for the last 20 years has been talking just solely about fair trade.
Well, so back to the question then remains how, and I'll pose this really to all three members as sort of last part of the questions before we get to the Q&A, but how should Chinese businesses, our members here in CGCC on the call, how should they better position themselves in the U.S. market? I mean, there's certainly a lot of people a lot of companies that may be on hold, if you will, but they've already invested over $120 billion. They indirectly support millions of jobs. They directly support hundreds of thousands of jobs in the U.S. economy. How should they position themselves then better, both at the local level and at the national level? And let me start with Bryan, since you just started that, and then we'll go to Craig and we'll close on the ambassador.
Yeah, I think you have to separate it in two issues, you know, tech, non-tech. You know, I think if you're a Chinese tech company looking to enter the U.S. market, you have to look at TikTok and WeChat and see that you've got to mitigate your risks, because there's a tremendous amount of risk because of the new flag of national security. If you're a company that's making T-shirts, you know, that's manufacturing T-shirts, it's a much different set of issues that prevent you from getting into the market and being successful, and then nothing really prevents you. But if you are a tech company, there are real issues. You know, CFIUS is going to come into play, as Craig mentioned. It's been updated, it's been expanded to now look at some of these difficult questions. You know, even to revisit some old issues. So, I mean, you know, I think a tech company, you know, because of the nature of things, because of the obscurity of things, because of the lack of information, I think has to be very cautious and has to be very proficient and very thorough entering the U.S. market. I mean, I've worked for Chinese companies where we sat down across from the Department of Commerce, as an example. And they were completely oblivious to what we actually, you know, how we actually operated and what we actually did. I mean, these were the experts, you know, at the Department of Commerce, not to be critical of anybody there, but they had a completely different view of some of the things that we were doing in that particular company. So, you know, you have to engage, you know, if you're a tech company, more so than if you're just a typical manufacturer, because there's just a lot of suspicions, and there's a lot of people here in Washington, D.C. that are definitely looking to trip you guys, to trip up tech companies. And right now the environment's not that hard.
Craig?
So two things. One is that I think this applies to U.S. companies as well, but especially for Chinese companies, there have to be two different strategies for what happens in November. I think a strategy for post-November that is the same for both candidates probably poses a risk. Because as we've heard today from the panelists, they are going to approach China differently. And so you probably have to have two strategies from that point on. I think the other thing is, and I think Bryan was kind of alluding to this, is that if you look at all of the subsectors in the US in which you might elect to invest, and you lay them all out on a grid, and you think about where you as a Chinese company want to invest, stop for a moment and stop looking at that grid like a Chinese investor and start looking like a US regulator. And where is a US regulator going to color in red as a danger area or a high risk area? And what I think Chinese companies will find is that there are still spaces on that grid that are green, that are open. But you've got to start looking at this like those who might oppose your investment would, so that you don't have a conflict with them 3 months into your proposed investment.
That's good. I think that's very good advice. Ambassador?
I agree with both commentators. There is a difference between tech and non-tech, and it's clear. Second, I also think it's very important to have two plans, one for Biden presidency, one for Trump presidency. They'll be very different. We've talked about some of the similarities, and there will be some similarities, but they will also be very different. My other bit of advice is to hang in there. This too shall pass. It may take a year, it may take 2 or 3 years. Hang in there, do the best you can. Keep building those relationships as much as you can, because it will pass. That is the hysteria between the two countries, especially the American hysteria against China. It's going to die down. It's not going to last that much longer. Why do I say that? I say that because it has to. We have to work with China. We have no alternative. As I said, China is not going anywhere. It's a country 4 times our population. Its GDP is going to exceed that of the US not too many years from now. Chinese are very industrious. They're very smart. They're very hardworking. And the more we try as a country, I'm changing gears here, try to put China down, more than that's going to hurt the United States, because China will go elsewhere. They'll go Asia, India, even in Europe, divide and conquer. They'll figure out ways to get stuff done. They just will. And frankly, all these recent actions, TikTok, WeChat, and some others are just forcing China to double down and go its own direction. And believe me, when they do, they're going to do very well. They're so smart. They're so aggressive, so hardworking. They're survivalists. They got thousands of years under their belt. And I just think we have to figure out a way to work with them, not against them.
Very, very good advice and a very good closing remark. I'm going to go through I know we're coming to the end of our time limit, but I'm going to go through a very quick lightning round, if you will. I've got a fair number of questions here. I can't take every one, but maybe just a one-word answer, and I'll try to feel it to who I think may be best positioned to answer the question. So our first question here, I'm gonna go to Bryan on this one, given you're in Washington. What can business leaders do to influence political leaders towards a more positive and meaningful change of the current path?
Yeah, listen, I think with this administration, talk about the economic footprint that China has here in the U.S. I mean, there are a lot of companies, there are Chinese companies that are selling American goods in China. Those companies, and there's thousands of them, are part of an economic supply chain. They're part of an economic, chain. I would highlight those, especially with this administration, since they're so singularly focused on economic activity, on job growth, job creation, job investment. I think that would probably be the best way to lean in on those things. But I think that exists there. So
is that a stronger, basically, lobbying effort to kind of educate the members of
Congress? I'm not going to, sometimes it requires lobbying, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's complex, which, then you have to get lawyers and everybody involved. And sometimes, it's a very simple thing. But But I think, at this particular juncture, these are the steps they have to have. I mean, when we lobby the administration, when we go in there, at least from a lobbying perspective, and talk about the companies that we represent, we always talk about the economic value that these companies here represent in the U.S. and that the actions of this administration may have on that economic value. That, at least from our perspective, has helped slow down and sort of given us an opportunity to pivot to other issues. Because this administration looks at it as like, do our policies, how do they affect job growth? How do they affect economic activity? And if you can make a strong enough argument that you're big enough that you guys are importing, that they're responsible for exporting a significant amount of American goods into China, I think you're in a much stronger pace or in a much stronger position than if you're a company that doesn't.
Ambassador, if Biden is elected, does TPP get resurrected? I know it's a longer question, but maybe you can give us a one-word answer on that, or a brief answer.
Yes, but not right away. I felt that was the biggest strategic mistake, geopolitical mistake we've made when I was serving as ambassador. That is deep sixing TPP. It hurt us immeasurably in Southeast Asia. It looked like we were leaving. Other countries wanted us to stay. I remember talking to the Vietnam ambassador. He said, "Mr. Ambassador, you got to pass TPP. You got to. Why? Because we like to play you off against China. If you leave, then it's hard for us to resist China." Answer is something like that down the road, maybe amended along with what Japan's put together, but it's very important that the United States pursue it. Going back to your last question, if I might, very briefly, a bit of advice for Chinese companies doing business in the U.S. Spend time with your senator or your congressman. And if you're a company and you got a presence in a certain state or a certain congressional district, go in and talk to him or her and explain what you're doing, because most of them care more about what's going on in their congressional district or in their state than they do what's going on in the country generally. So spend time with your congressperson and spend time with your senator if you're already located somewhere in the United States.
I think I'm going to have to leave it at there, as we are really brushing up on the end of our hour. I really want a few final comments. I want to thank everybody for sharing their insights and experiences. We had an exciting debate. We had debate from both sides of the aisle. Professor had to leave us early, but I look forward to hosting both Bryan and the professor for a drink or dinner post-COVID, but post-election and with social distancing, of course. But the 2020 year has been critical for businesses and policymakers, and it will certainly continue to be so, and will determine really the trajectory of U.S. China relations. I'd like to conclude by saying that CGCC is committed to facilitating cooperation, building trust, and represents the interests of both Chinese and American companies as they seek to expand their operations and investments both in the U.S. and across borders. I'm sure we can find a brighter future as we increase the mutual understanding, which really seemed to be a common theme, is that we just still don't know enough about each other, whether they're cultural differences or strategic differences. And I think communication and dialogue, along with leveraging our strengths and overcoming our weaknesses and these misunderstandings, is really going to be the key to a successful relationship.